With us is Jack Levy, partner at More VC. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
How successful are new blended mechanisms of funding innovation? Do you have some examples good to share involving activities of European Investment Bank or the European Investment Fund?
So first of all, the European Investment Fund is an anchor investor in my own fund. So I certainly have experience with them and with their process and the way that they help catalyze funds to raise capital from privates. But I think from a blended perspective, I think what you're talking about is now there's more and more efforts to grant startups themselves, both grants and then to offer equity investments as well. And I've begun to hear about this, and I actually just heard about it recently from one startup. What I liked about it was that the equity side was also an offer, so they didn't necessarily have to take it. And that was very nice. It gave them more access to capital. The grant was a grant. It's not dilutive to the founder. They were obviously very happy to take that. But then they were also able to effectively use the offer to try to go out and raise more private capital around it. And again, these efforts, just like the EIF's investment in our fund helped catalyze the private investors, these efforts help catalyze private investments into companies directly. So I welcome them. It's in the past you saw grants, and then separately you saw equity investments. This kind of blending opportunity is a way to try to give the founders of the companies more capital potentially initially.
Thank you. What advice would you give to investors to facilitate access to blended, I will repeat that. What advice would you give to innovators to facilitate access to blended funds?
I think, again, that you have to just keep your ears out. There's constant new funds being offered through the Horizon 2020 program. Now we're hearing about the EIC and now the Green Deal. And in Israel, obviously, it's the Innovation Authority. And in the other regions of the world, there are other programs like this. More of them are adopted these blended mechanisms. The founders and entrepreneurs that we know stay on top of these. They don't go for each and every one. You obviously want to go for the ones that make sense for you at that point in time. They each have their own restrictions / certain types of focuses of where you have to invest your time and effort. Some want consortiums, some in Israel, of course, require that the IP will remain in Israel. So each company adapts to that, but they're well publicized, and ISERD in Israel does a phenomenal job of keeping that information in front of the entrepreneurs.
Thank you. What should be done to improve Israeli perceptions of the EU market as favorable scale-up opportunity?
It's very interesting. I think that it is a good market, meaning the Israeli entrepreneur likes the market. The challenge really is something that's never going to change, and we wouldn't want it to change, and that's the multilingual aspect of it. So as much as it is one market, it still isn't one market from the perspective of building a company, right? You have to build, you have to translate, you have to have different salespeople, you have to understand different cultures. And so that's maybe sometimes what gets an Israeli entrepreneur to think, oh, compared to the US market, similar size, maybe even a little bit bigger, depending on what they're doing, specifically one attack. Now, I often say that's not necessarily the case. The US is very diverse as well. You can't necessarily just locate one salesperson to cover the US as well. And frankly, in Europe, it's actually easier to do that geographically. And so I think that, though, is the main barrier. I think a lot of Israeli entrepreneurs view the European market to some extent as closer, easier to cover from Israel. And like I said, even geographically, I mean, we have one company with 4 salespeople. They basically cover the entire European Union, right? And that's doable. And I mean by car now in the COVID period when they can't be flying, right? So that's a wonderful thing. You can't do that in the US market. So I don't know if we have to increase the reputation. I really just think that to some extent, if Europe feels, oh, why does the Israeli entrepreneur often look first to the US? Sometimes it's just because of that one language, one market approach. Which again, like I said, isn't even necessarily always the case.
Sure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.